And to start the sermon off this morning, I'll start in a familiar way with singing a hymn, which I know that many of you really like and enjoy. And I bet you can guess which hymn I'll be singing next. How could anyone ever tell you you were anything less than beautiful? How could anyone ever tell you you were less than whole? How could anyone fail to notice that your loving is a miracle? How deeply you're connected to my soul. Now, I love this hymn so much, not only because it speaks to the core of what we're exploring today, what it means to be radically welcoming as a community. It's also a hymn that became an anthem for me in my UU teenage years, challenging and affirming years of growing into a greater sense of my own identity as a queer person. Hearing this hymn for the first time as we sang together at a coming of age retreat, a group of teens, hands clasped in a circle under a cathedral of ancient California redwoods. This message of unconditional love and acceptance hit home for me. It was a time in my teenage years that I felt that I didn't have to be anybody else, that all that I was and was becoming was seen and cherished. I felt deeply connected to the souls of my peers, just as it was affirmed in me that I was nothing short of beautiful and whole. Moments like this created a spiritual home for me in Unitarian Universalism. And in fact, I felt such a strong, potent message of welcome that I recognized within myself that I was called to bring this to others, both in my life and my future ministry. You see, I first knew that I was what it was to belong because I belonged in Unitarian Universalism. It was this faith that would bring me comfort and community in the wake of some turbulent chapters of my life. This message of love, belonging, and inclusion would eventually give me the strength that I needed to accept my sexuality, to recognize that there was nothing wrong or broken in me. It would help me to swallow my fear as I hit the little blue post button on the social media post that would be my coming out on the car ride home from General Assembly after marriage equality had become the law of the land. What we have to offer the world and one another is such a powerful and needed message, especially now more than ever. This morning in our annual welcoming congregation service, we're continuing to ask ourselves what it means to lean into radical hospitality as a community. In light of January's theme of taking measure, we're given this opportunity to take stock of who we are and how it is that we welcome others. Now, last year, First Parish reached its goal of renewing its welcoming congregation status. And this is where I'll ask Matt if you wouldn't mind sharing our certificate that we got from last year on the screen. This is just so cool to look at, just all the work that went into this. We had a great amount of participation from you all in the Transforming Hearts module, where many of you were eager to learn more about inclusive practices for queer and trans people. Thank you so much, Matt. It makes me so proud, too, that First Parish also held a greatly successful virtual Trans Day of Remembrance vigil this past November, where we had upwards of 20 participants on the call, many of whom were queer and trans folks who had never been to First Parish before. And in our current national moment of continued violence and systemic injustice against Black, Indigenous people, and people of color, we've asked ourselves how we might live out our faith and stand up to protect Black and brown lives. Now, I don't think we've been asleep to these questions and conversations as a community. In fact, I think we've actually been eager to engage. Now, one of the ideas that we had talked about in Transforming Hearts way back in September, if you can remember, is this idea of intersections. How people are living their lives at the meeting points of different identities and experiences. For example, someone who is a Black queer woman holds different intersections than a white, able bodied man. And the way that we experience these different intersections is compounded. The intersecting oppressions in society oftentimes build on one another, where a person has to navigate social groups and systems, knowing that parts of themselves are accepted or not accepted, depending on the space. In my own lived experience, I live at the intersections of being white, cisgender, male, and gay. In some areas of my identity, being white and male, for example, I hold a large amount of privilege. I don't have to worry about walking into a store or being followed around for being seen as suspicious. Or my voice in most spaces isn't questioned or second guessed on account of my maleness. However, there are intersections where I experience oppression. In many public spaces, I have to do the mental calculus and ask myself if it's safe enough to hold hands or to show affection with a date, or if how I'm dressing that day might actually be putting myself in danger. I have to sift through social interactions wondering if it's safe enough for me to be out, or if it's better that I not make that part of my identity known. And in some spaces, because I am a gay man, I'm not seen as man enough. My masculinity is called into question, as I often see and experience in many all-male groups. Now, although each one of us lives at different intersections, I think this is a familiar experience for each one of us. At some point in our lives, we are confronted with questions about whether we belong, whether it's safe enough for us to let our guard down or be open. We're having to ask ourselves, do I really belong here? Am I really welcome to bring my full self? And tragically, we must ask ourselves also, what parts of myself might I have to leave at the door? The greater question that I have for you this morning is, what would it take to make First Parish a community where every person might feel welcome to bring their fullest self? What might it be for us to create a growing table of welcome, where we are aware of both who is seated at the table and who has yet to still pull up a chair? In our reading from this morning from the UU World article, The Spiritual Practice of Hospitality, by David Reineck, that Lynn read so beautifully, we see the act of hospitality and welcome reframed as a sort of spiritual practice. As Reineck writes, practicing hospitality expresses our belief in the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Through our actions of hospitality, we move toward creating a world in which we are all treated with justice, equity, and compassion. We have little control over conflicts in another part of the world, but we can practice truly honoring the preciousness of all human life by how we enter into relationship with each other. If we are serious about creating a more just, equitable, and compassionate world, we have to start with the room that we are in. Now, I know that we are in virtual Zoom rooms these days, but I think First Parish is serious about living out radical welcome in all that we are and do. And I am so proud of the strong commitment that so many of you have shown each week to make this welcome wider. If we understand hospitality and welcome as ongoing practices, things that we do that we are working to improve constantly, much like practicing an instrument or learning a new skill, we become open to seeing the work that we have yet still to do. The words we say matter. The message we convey with our actions, both subtle and overt cues of welcome that we give as a community, are so immeasurably important. This is reflected beautifully in the piece Words Matter, written by the Reverend Carol Sissel, a Black Unitarian Universalist minister who writes, "A sense of being acknowledged and valued moves from my heart to my head. My heart blooms, and I feel like the welcome table has been set before me, and I am eager to pull up a chair." Reverend Sissel speaks about how we so often put words like diverse, multicultural, inclusive, and welcoming in our orders of service and on our websites. And yet, many of our communities are still longing for greater diversity and inclusion. What's important is that we work to ensure that we are fully aware of what all of these different words mean. Seeing our role in practicing welcome and hospitality, especially to those who are most at the margins of society. This is one such way that we might live out our promise made through these very important words. This must be an active and ongoing practice, unless we risk making these words simple, empty promises. Words that we say that we are about and still have yet to fully act on. Now, in our Time for All Ages story this morning, the story read by Michael Hall that Jada just read so incredibly. A crayon who is really blue inside goes through the painful experience of being told that he isn't good enough. He goes about life entering spaces where his blueness is overlooked and undervalued. It's not until the crayon makes a kind friend, someone that welcomes him to be his bluest self, to draw out the bluest whales and oceans, that he finally understands that he belongs. At first, there wasn't space made for the blue crayon at the table. The things that others said about his failure to be read, going about his life being mislabeled and unseen, these things stung deep. And like the blue crayon, like how he experienced once he was affirmed in all that he was, bringing all of his blue self with him, our faith too has a saving message for people who are told each and every day that their worth and dignity are up for debate. We have the opportunity to be a sanctuary, a refuge where someone is welcomed to shed their fears and false labels, and to be exactly as they are. Our life-saving message is too precious to be locked up in empty words of welcome. We must see pursuing radical welcome as a spiritual discipline, a vision that isn't ever fully complete, but is something that we are dedicated to working at over and over again. So, what are the ways that we can further live into radical welcome as a community? How especially do we do this as a global pandemic rages and when community as we once knew it is entirely virtual? One of the first ways to really engage in this conversation is to actually engage. And I've been so impressed with the ways that folks here at First Parish have just been so eager to join Zoom groups, Zoom book discussion groups, and to participate in social justice. Finding these opportunities to be involved and to grow in what we know and what we understand is huge, and learning about the ways that we might improve being an inclusive and welcoming community. And today, after the service, you have the opportunity to join in our visioning conversation around the lessons that we've learned from the pandemic about ourselves, our communities, and the world around us. Coming up also in February, on February 28th, Reverend Stephanie is preaching about beloved community and the proposed eighth principle of Unitarian Universalism, which is another chance for us to talk about our community and its growth toward greater inclusion. Some other small ways that we can extend our circle of welcome, even online, is to welcome newcomers in coffee hour, to be a friendly and warm presence in those breakout groups, and to even follow up with these new connections outside of the service with someone that you don't necessarily know. While we aren't able to be with one another in person and linger in the vestry with our warm coffee like we used to, we still have the chance to welcome new folks to our community who are joining us online. And likewise, another simple thing that we can do, like we had talked about last year when I preached on the differences between equity and equality, we can include our pronouns next to our names in the Zoom name bar, a sort of virtual name tag that we have. And this is something that you often see Stephanie, Kate, Matt, and myself doing. While we miss our physical name tags, where many of us had actually started to write out our pronouns, this is also a beautiful sign and gesture to transgender and non-binary folks who are visiting us, saying that we value them, that ours is a space where it is safe and that you will be valued and honored with the pronouns that you use. I want to return to my own story, singing with a circle of teenagers on a coming of age retreat beneath the California redwoods. For me, I was lucky that Unitarian Universalism held me and loved me as I was in all of the different intersections of my identity. I understood that at a deep and fundamental level that I belonged and that I was welcome to bring my fullest self. It breaks my heart that not everyone has had this experience in our communities. We have such a powerful vision and message that we have no choice but to do and to be better. There is a whole world out there that needs to hear it. So may we be a community that, despite our virtual walls, continuously strives to widen our welcome, to welcome the stranger, to bear witness to the many injustices facing our nation and world. As we continue in these next weeks and months, may we be open to taking measure of who we are and who we are called to become. May we be ready to love one another in all of our fullness, to create a place at the virtual table for all who would share in our community, for those who are most in need of our life-saving and life-affirming message. May it be so, and amen. We'll now go to Lucy, who will lead us in singing our closing hymn, How Could Anyone?